Well, what about Shepard? Earthborn, but no record of his family.
Doesn't have one. He was raised on the streets, learned to look out for himself.
He saw his whole unit die on a cruise. He could have some serious emotional scars.
Every soldier has scars. Shepard's a survivor.
Is that the kind of person we want protecting the galaxy?
That's the only kind of person who can protect the galaxy.
I'll make the call.
After the massive success of Knights of the Old Republic, at the time acclaimed RPG studio BioWare was ready to branch out into an entirely new direction, one of immense scope. Pitched as Project SFX by project director Casey Hudson for the follow-up to Microsoft's hit Xbox console, the Xbox 360, SFX from its inception was conceived to be the most ambitious role-playing game ever made. A galaxy-spanning RPG where the player would explore procedurally generated planets in a futuristic setting inspired by the sleek looks of properties such as Star Trek, Blade Runner, and Dune, SFX was envisioned to use cutting-edge technology to deliver an unforgettable narrative, with a focus on characters, world building, and exploration no other game had ever achieved. Combined with light MMO elements such as meeting other players across the galaxy to trade, interact, and do quests with, in some ways the project seemed to be too ambitious for its own good. With history as hindsight, it was. Yet while the online components and procedurally generated galaxy design had to be cut due to limitations, time, and budget, the core of the experience remained. Speaking about the project, programmer Ryan Hole notes, quote, "It was such a huge idea. How do we make something that's fun and interesting that's not just Star Wars, but keep some of the things that made Knights of the Old Republic so awesome, like having choice that affects the universe, and maybe even take that on a bigger scale?" End quote. Developed on the unfinished Unreal Engine 3 alongside Gears of War, Mass Effect, despite its cuts from the original SFX document, was shaping up to be a monumental release for the role-playing genre. Envisioned as a trilogy from the very beginning, the team at BioWare worked hard to get this project towards its eventual release date in 2007. And that work came with a notable human cost, as the team was crunched immensely with the new project. Speaking about the struggle of the development, lead designer Preston Watamaniak notes, quote, "When you're dealing with new IP, with new gameplay systems, change management becomes almost a daily process. So yes, there were late nights and we worked very, very hard. Because that change management introduced a lot of requirements when you're working that third type of crunch. There was also the first and second types of crunches as well, where I worked late nights because I knew what I was doing was making the project better, and I was excited about the project." End quote. Despite the crunch seemingly being an agreed upon work ethic, it clearly took its toll, as Steve Shim, audio design lead, ended up leaving BioWare on the first day he worked on Mass Effect 2. In fact, it was the game's E3 demo in 2006 that had the team realize what the engine could do and was a pivotal point in figuring out the direction of the game. With that boost of confidence, Mass Effect managed to launch in 2007 to both critical acclaim and strong sales, setting the foundation for the rest of the franchise as well as BioWare, which would be bought by Electronic Arts during the final months of the project. The development time and project goals are notable and need to be taken into consideration because of where BioWare and Mass Effect as a franchise are at this stage. In many ways, it is easy to blame a shift of culture or EA meddling in the development of BioWare's recent releases, and in many ways, both of these statements are indeed true. However, the fact that at arguably their greatest creative peak, issues of crunch were still at this level brings about two issues that are core to the series, as well as BioWare's trajectory. First, the chase of the space opera game, an experience with unlimited worlds and endless content via procedural generation, is one that even to this day has barely been realized. And even if some aspects of this idea have come to fruition, it has not lived up to the experience and ambition that SFX set out to do. No Man's Sky was infamous for its failed promises and gameplay mechanics at launch, and even with the improvements and additions that have made it a worthwhile and immensely enjoyable experience, it notably doesn't match the narrative strength and focus of the space operas of legend, such as Star Wars, Dune, or Star Trek. Games such as Star Citizen are not even close to being finished, and the most recent attempt at a space opera focused on exploration and narrative, as well as role-playing, Starfield, has been critiqued and lambasted by many for its lack of meaningful exploration and role-playing depth. The second and more damning issue is that BioWare as a company has never been stable. The issues that arose with the development struggles of games such as Anthem, Dragon Age Inquisition, Veilguard, and Mass Effect Andromeda were symptoms of mismanagement, crunch, and ambition that have been embedded in BioWare's culture even before EA bought the company. With the breakdown of Anthem's development by Jason Schreier, as well as former BioWare legend Mark Dara talking about how awful BioWare magic is, showing these issues more directly. All of this is to say that despite the issues that BioWare has gone through, as well as the unreachable promises of SFX, it is arguable that the first Mass Effect, through its insane crunch and all, was and remains the closest BioWare has ever been to achieving the potential of SFX, while also changing the landscape of the gaming industry forever. What immediately sets Mass Effect apart from what came before it in the CRPG landscape is its presentation and visuals. At the time, the focus on role-playing systems and narrative for Western RPGs often meant that graphics and presentation came as a secondary focus. That isn't to say that the graphical presentation was awful, but in comparison to the Japanese counterparts such as Final Fantasy, Shin Megami Tensei, and other franchises, the level of presentation, graphical prowess, and cinematic direction were not a major reason CRPGs were played. Mass Effect, in contrast, was utterly focused on its sense of cinematic presentation and appeal. From the character creation screen being a built-in part of the universe, Mass Effect strived to immerse the player into its galaxy, and that sense of immersion and production value was further bolstered by its cutscenes, which were not only plentiful in comparison to other CRPGs, but had a strong sense of direction and focus. Sweeping shots of planets, erratic camera movements during action, or still shots focusing on characters or the moments, bolstered with music that felt tailored to the scene happening was a rarity for CRPGs at the time. Yet Mass Effect did all of this without missing a beat. Having incredible cinematics is one thing, but animations and voice acting will push Mass Effect to another level. Nearly every NPC in this game has dialogue that is voiced, with different variations and branching paths depending on which NPCs are being talked to, bolstered by the immense innovations in animation. Emotions such as anger, sadness, or even a subtle smirk are on full display, with many of the conversations within the game taking place in real time, as well as using body language to enforce their dialogue. Though some animations repeat, like the infamous walk to the side of the screen once dialogue ends, for 2007, no other RPG came close. It would take years for other franchises from the West to match the level of detail Mass Effect showed near effortlessly. All of this is further bolstered by the incredible art direction and look of Mass Effect. True to the concept, the universe of Mass Effect manages to look astounding, with the increase in fidelity and hardware making each environment stand out immensely. The cockpit of the Normandy, the main ship and hub for the player, is a prime example of this detail, with multiple characters, different screens, and lighting going all on at once, allowing the player to feel like the ship is both lived in and an astonishment of technology, and it is only the tip of the iceberg. The white neo-futuristic elite Presidium, bustling with multiple businessmen and cars racing by, the blue noir-esque atmosphere of the lower wards, with lighting obscuring the shadier sides of the market in shadows and deep reds, and the Blade Runner-inspired Club Corey's Den, are all fantastic examples of environments that the player can get lost into. But they are also contrasted fantastically with planets like Pharos, decimated by combat and barely holding together, Noveria, the corporate ice planet that shows a sense of secrecy before said secrets are revealed, and Ilos, overgrown and ancient, giving off how this planet hasn't been touched for millennia. Music also pushes this art direction and atmosphere to another level. Led by main composer Jack Wall, the soundtrack of Mass Effect enforces both a feeling of the future and mystery. Heavy synths, the droning industrial sounds, combined with orchestral production and quality, make every single location within the game stand out on top of how they look. The lighter, calm tone of the Citadel with subtle dark synths, hinting at the crime within the inner wards, contrasts with the ominous jungle-inspired sounds in Pharos, the cold corporate feel of Noveria, or the desolate and haunting feel of the uncharted worlds explored throughout the galaxy. Combat scenarios also give off an incredible feel of tension and action, with the synths getting heavier, rapid, and alarming, allowing multiple tracks to feel custom-made to the moments experienced within the story in a way the scores in movies were, whether it be moments of triumph, revelations, sadness, or romance. Mass Effect exudes cinematic spectacle from the moment the player starts to the ending. That isn't to say that every environment is to this level, however, as the planetary explorations for side quests show how limiting the technology and resources were at the time for BioWare's desire to explore the galaxy. Multiple planets have little to interact with, being barren landscapes outside of established landmarks, most of which are repeated landscapes, such as scientific buildings, mines, or mercenary complexes. What makes the exploration of the planets even more repetitive are the collectibles, such as matriarch writings, Turian insignias, Prothean artifacts, Solarian IDs and medallions, and the numerous resources, which, unlike the other collectibles, are not marked on the map, meaning that without an online map, the player will have to wander the planet to find all of the mineral deposits. Perhaps the most infamous aspect of planetary exploration is the main rare traversal, the M35 Mako, a rover tank hybrid that can scale mountains and space jump, equipped with a turret and cannon to fight against larger targets. In the original release, the Mako was frustratingly hard to control and struggled to scale mountains, and although its weapons were strong, XP was decreased while in the Mako for defeating enemies, meaning the optimal way to grind XP would be to weaken targets, then jump out for the final blow with regular weapons. Thankfully, the Legendary Edition, a remaster of all three games in the trilogy for the 8th and 9th generation consoles, would remove the XP decrease and rework the Mako's controls, allowing smoother movement, better defense, and the addition of a boost, making mountain climbing and traversal less of a hassle, though they still do pop up from time to time. Side quests themselves, outside of the collectibles, also ease up the issue of repetitive content, as although they might take place in reused areas, they're great ways to gain more information and lore within the galaxy, shed light on certain races and factions, and even set up plot lines and narratives the trilogy later follows up on. Ranging from finding a downed probe and chasing down Pyjax for its module, to dealing with a rogue VR on Earth's moon, who later becomes an important companion in the next two games, to disarming a nuke, the side quests of Mass Effect, titled Assignments, provide greater insight, as well as the ones on planets with the main quest, known as missions, possibly providing an impact on the missions themselves. That level of role-playing depth is also shown within the combat, classes, and customization, though with the bones of cover shooters of that era. Mass Effect can effectively be described as a role-playing game with third-person shooting mechanics, as the player levels up numerous skill trees, weapons, and abilities throughout their playtime, ranging from 1 to 60 or 1 to 30, depending on if the player is using the Legendary Edition level scaling. The player character, Commander Shepard, has access to 6 different classes, namely Soldier, Engineer, Adept, Infiltrator, Vanguard, and Sentinel, with the latter 3 being different combinations of the former 3. Soldier, Engineer, and Adept are all futuristic renditions of their fantasy counterparts, with soldiers being focused on firepower and resilience, engineers using tech and hacking to debuff and debilitate enemies, and adepts using dark energy known as biotics to create barriers, use telekinesis, or break down enemies at the subatomic level. As for the latter three classes, Infiltrator is a combination of Soldier and Engineer, Vanguard is a combination of Soldier and Adept, and Sentinel is a combination of Adept and Engineer. Each class also has a squad mate that acts for that role, with 2 squad mates accompanying Shepard throughout missions and assignments, meaning that the player will need to think of what squad mates are best for each different scenario. A prime example is the use of the skills Decryption and Electronics, which not only allow for tech-based classes to disable enemy weapons and shields, but are also necessary to unlock certain containers throughout different levels and planets across the galaxy. Role-playing is further emphasized by the combat loop of Mass Effect, as although it is based around cover shooting, enemies are varied and can use powers and abilities just like the player. On harder difficulties, this can mean the wrong squad combination will lead to the player's death quickly, so noting the strengths and weaknesses of each squad mate and the player's toolkit is paramount. Combat in Mass Effect is mainly a test of both accuracy with firearms and power usage via the radial wheel, with many powers having different effects within combat. Weapon powers augment the weapon, such as Carnage making the shotgun bullet a high-powered energy blast, or Overkill drastically increasing the damage and fire rate of assault rifles. Tech powers can replenish shields, disrupt enemies, bolster first aid usage, and control synthetic enemies, while biotic abilities debuff enemies, freeze enemies in time, or manipulate forces of gravity, resulting in total battlefield control. If it seems the more physical classes like Soldiers pale in comparison, not only do they gain access to powers like Adrenaline Rush, refreshing every cooldown, and immunity for actually boosting their physical defense, they also gain access to the most amount of weapons. Similar to traditional RPGs, each class is trained in a set amount of weapons, and using an untrained weapon meant that the player was unable to even aim down the sight. To note, the Legendary Edition removes this penalty, but untrained weapons still do not get a skill tree for additional damage and accuracy. As noted, soldiers gain the most amount of weapons, being able to use the pistol, assault rifle, shotgun, and sniper rifle, while every other class gets a different assortment of weapons to compensate for their power usage, with adepts and sentinels only being able to use their pistols. This also influences squad choice, as not having a sniper or squad mate that can snipe can result in deaths due to the enemies equipped with snipers or lacking crowd control via a shotgun. However, while the depth of role-playing is fantastic, the weapons themselves, enemy AI, and equipment customization are more of a mixed bag, because while BioWare adapted the combat to work in a real-time third-person sandbox, it's very showing that this was their first full attempt. In terms of enemy design, while many different variants require different strategies and class combinations to deal with, the AI itself, even with the Legendary Edition updates, do not feel as responsive or as adaptive as other shooters around the time, getting stuck on collision, repeating lines, or often darting across the room without aim, all of which can be made even worse if dealing with biotic enemies that can knock Shepard down. Teammate AI can also confound this problem, with certain commands to the squad being ignored or the AI losing its pathfinding. While it never occurs enough to ruin the entire experience, it is a notable damper on the flow of combat, and combined with the player character's stiff movements, it's easy to see why the largest critique of the game at launch was about its combat. Weapons, armor, and tools themselves also initially showed an issue of inexperience within third-person gunplay, as although Shepard and his squad will come across hundreds of guns and armor sets, outside of cosmetic appearance, most of these items are merely upgrades in terms of damage and performance, not feeling like an entirely different gun to use, making the combat's repetitiveness stick out, especially when playing as a class with a limited weapon pool. Although certain armor sets give unique bonuses, such as environmental protection from planetary hazards or healing per second, none of these bonuses are worth not taking armor or gear with higher shielding and plating, with only the last two sets, the Predator Light Medium Heavy, or Colossus set, being something the player has to consider within their character build. The Legendary Edition, however, does make a substantial improvement to the system, making multiple different weapon archetypes within each weapon type, such as full auto, semi-auto, and burst fire, making the combat feel like it has more depth, putting less of a focus on raw stats and more on overall performance, at least until the in-game tier weapons become available. That depth is also enforced by the game's expansive modding system, allowing players to directly customize how their guns perform, leading to a variety of different playstyles with each firearm. Mods such as incendiary rounds, toxic rounds to decrease enemy power usage, ammo types for synthetic and organic targets, dampeners to decrease the overheating of weapons, accuracy optics, or the most powerful, high explosive rounds, doing massive damage and knockback at the cost of your weapons massively overheating faster, can not only have the player feel equipped for multiple situations, but also allow for experimentation within different playthroughs on top of different class choices and builds. The only notable downside to this, however, is the way the game handles its inventory, as while it is not difficult to navigate, the number of weapons, items, and gear the player gets from defeating enemies can quickly become a burden, with an inventory limit meaning that a player will at a certain point be constantly either selling their unused gear or dismantling it into Omnigel, material that can be used to bypass hacking puzzles and repairing the damage done to the Mako. With a limit of 999 Metagel and 9,999,999 credits, at a certain point, dismantling becomes less of an arduous but beneficial task and more of a notable inconvenience, one that is made worse by a second playthrough on the same character having their items doubled. As shown, however, even when the game falters in terms of its leap to real-time combat and customization, the role-playing aspects, atmosphere, direction, and innovations within the genre are apparent, even before discussing what makes Mass Effect loved and discussed to this day, the narrative and characters. Taking place in the future year of 2183, Mass Effect follows Commander Shepard, a young but decorated soldier of the Systems Alliance, a galactic representation of humanity, as they end up wrapped in a plot that threatens to destroy the entire galaxy. Right from the start, Mass Effect builds its role-playing aspects directly into the narrative, as Commander Shepard had a pre-military and service background that not only determines who they were before the player takes control, but also determines how certain NPCs and even quest lines react to the player. A prime example is the aforementioned nuke disarm, in which, if the player chose to have their Shepard be a war hero, the criminal that armed the nuke wanted it to be Shepard to fall into the trap, as it was Shepard who single-handedly stopped the attack on a human colony known as Elysium before the events of the game. What makes Shepard both unique, but also polarizing in terms of the role-playing game genre, however, are two key aspects that influence the rest of the genre for better and for worse: voice acting and the dialogue wheel. Unlike previous BioWare games, and most Western RPGs at the time with a few notable exceptions such as Planescape Torment, Mass Effect's Commander Shepard had full voice acting and dialogue, performed by Mark Meer if male and Jennifer Hale if female. This decision alone changed how role-playing feels within the trilogy in comparison to other Western RPGs before it. Typically, having a silent protagonist with dialogue choices weaved into the game allowed the player to step into the world of the game directly, immersing themselves in a way a voice protagonist doesn't. How a line can come across, the characterization, and the personality of these protagonists are a combination of the writing and the player's idealization of who they've created, leading to almost limitless creativity and role-playing potential for many games. By having Shepard voiced, Even though there are multiple choices and decisions the player can make, who Shepard is, how they conversate with people, and how their characterization is performed is much less flexible. Such removal of role-playing potential can dampen how the player approaches the world, as they do not feel like an extension of the world in a way a non-voice protagonist can be. Not to mention the issue of a line read being completely different from what the player had in mind. Further compounding the latter issue is the dialogue wheel, allowing the player to cycle between dialogue choices radially, rather than in a list like other games. This alone isn't a problem, but what makes it even more possible to lead to lackluster role-playing and writing is how the choices are presented, as Mass Effect's dialogue choices say a general idea of how Shepard will respond, not the exact dialogue. If the frustration of a different line reading was already a possibility due to voice acting, not knowing what exactly Shepard will say makes it even more of a problem. In later games such as Fallout 4 or Telltale games like The Wolf Among Us fall face first into these issues, with Fallout 4's dialogue wheel being infamous in how vague and nondescript it is, and The Wolf Among Us' infamous glass in moment. While the line read issue is present within Mass Effect, thankfully, most of the choices within the game are reflective of what the player thinks and will be said. And unlike later games that copy the system, what makes Mass Effect's use of the system work is how natural and well-written conversations with Shepard feel, as the performances of both Mir and Hale manage to make Shepard stand out in terms of role-playing protagonists in an excellent way, having great chemistry with the expanded cast throughout the entire trilogy, as well as never missing a beat in terms of the more dramatic moments. The dialogue wheel itself also makes sense when considering Mass Effect was initially an exclusive for the Xbox 360, and feels intuitive to use with a controller, providing fast responses that fit the real-time conversations of the game. With multiple branching paths and conversations between NPCs, even if the look of the system has changed, depth and world building are still primarily driven through dialogue like most great RPGs. Besides being designed for controlling and real-time conversations, the other reason the dialogue wheel exists is because of the main mechanic that drives Shepard's characterization and personality for the entire trilogy: the Paragon and Renegade system. Mass Effect was released at a time when morality systems were an industry standard, with other games such as BioShock, Infamous, Fable, and BioWare's previous projects Jade Empire and Knights of the Old Republic being examples of how the struggle between being an altruistic hero or evil monster was a common narrative trope, while also directly affecting gameplay. There are multiple reasons why the systems, for the most part, have been blatantly absent from most games in modern times. Firstly, most players only play through a game once, and data shows that even when tempted by great rewards, most players choose good over evil choices. Noted in an article by Simon Hill, quote, Megan Stark, senior narrative designer at Obsidian Entertainment, the game studio behind titles like The Outer Worlds, Tyranny, and Fallout New Vegas, says about 97% of its players prefer to align with a good path over an evil one, end quote. While it can be attributed to many players genuinely wanting to provide well into the worlds they inhabit, more often than not, game design and narrative frame the good routes of games as the optimal way to play, with the difference in how much power or wealth a character going on an evil route being minimal at best. BioShock is a prime example of this, as harvesting little sisters versus saving them provides only a minimal increase in Adam, the upgrade material of the game, with saving little sisters garnering other bonuses on top of the good ending. Mass Effect attempts to bypass these issues by having the Paragon and Renegade systems split into separate bars, meaning that making a Paragon decision will not take away Renegade points or vice versa. In terms of how morality within the narrative is handled, Paragon choices are typically altruistic, focusing on diplomatic solutions, while Renegade choices aren't meant to be utterly evil, but rather are about aggressive, pragmatic solutions, focusing on the mission above all else, matching the inspiration the television shows 24 had on the narrative. Hudson notes, quote, at the time, one of the things that was really popular was 24 and Jack Bauer. Obviously, as it's a show, you only see the one choice he takes, but Jack Bauer is constantly facing agonizing decisions, and the decisions are not, Should I do something completely altruistic, or should I just for no reason do something evil? Those choices are really not that interesting or realistic. But if you put someone in a situation where they're trying to do good, and there's a choice to be made about whether they do something that is in the near term less painful, or something that is in the near term quite brutal but to achieve the greater good, that becomes an interesting choice. As such, multiple renegade choices, while brutal, are not entirely evil, while multiple Paragon options show a possible naivety of the character, with the decision to spare the Rachni, an ancient race that destroyed the galaxy millennia ago, being a decision that could lead to more disastrous outcomes in the future. Multiple quests and dialogue choices can also be completed with either route as well, making it feel more like a choice in how Shepard will be defined. It is noted as an attempt, however, because there is one key issue that undermines the entire system: charm and intimidate. Certain NPCs have optional branching paths that allow the player to garner an additional outcome in missions and assignments, similar to the traditional persuasion and intimidation systems within other RPGs, with charm being Paragon-based and intimidate being renegade-based. That alone isn't an issue, but what is an issue is how charm and intimidate options are unlocked. Within the skill leveling screen, Shepard has both charm and intimidate as skill tree options, allowing higher levels within the skill to unlock additional options within the dialogue. Unlike other skills, however, charm and intimidate levels are only unlocked for skill point usage by increasing the respective Paragon or Renegade bar. What this means is that to unlock the hardest dialogue options within the game for the best outcome, the player is forced to strictly stick to either Paragon or Renegade for the entire playthrough unless they use exploits. Going for neutral options is often worse, as lukewarm responses garner no point gain and can result in the worst options in some cases. As such, the idea of the player having to think about whether or not the Paragon or Renegade response is the best solution feels completely undermined, a problem that only grows larger as the trilogy progresses. Even with this issue, Mass Effect's narrative and characters managed to go above and beyond, with the galaxy presented being one of the most outstanding worlds ever put to controller. Having Captain Anderson and Ambassador Udina, the two major human characters that support Shepard politically, narrate their background, choices, and why they are special immediately immerses the player into the setting. And with the tech scroll explaining humanity's journey into becoming accepted into the galaxy, as well as the main driving force of the galaxy being Element Zero in the Mass Effect fields, it becomes clear that Mass Effect strives to make the player feel every step of their journey as Commander Shepard, while also showing how much the details matter. Everything within Mass Effect adds to the world building of the setting. Guns overheating is explained as every gun having a miniature Mass Effect field. Biotics are attributed to Element Zero. Each gun and armor set comes from companies and corporations within the setting, and the result of all of this detail is a world that feels constructed with no stone left unturned in terms of how the universe works. Every conversation with an NPC from the moment Shepard gains control enriches the world, while never feeling like these characters are simply to spew exposition. Navigator press releases like to its Torians for the first contact rule is present without the character having to inquire about the reasons. The way Corporal Jenkins reacts to your background shows his naivety, and the dialogue between Nihilus, Captain Anderson, and Shepard builds a sense of mystery and intrigue into the universe. Capped off with the first look at the main villain of the entire trilogy, the Reapers. Landing on Eden Prime and seeing the original peaceful description of the colony contrasted with the hellish war zone it has become, and Jenkins getting unceremoniously gunned down within seconds of contact with the enemy force, lend to the immense danger and mystery that progresses throughout the game. Again, this was the first full role-playing experience BioWare had created that had world building meant to rival the science fiction greats. Pacing within the narrative is utterly fantastic, as although the character has freedom in how they progress the main narrative in terms of the three major planets in recruiting Dr. Liara Tassoni, a sorry scientist and daughter of one of the main antagonists, Matriarch Bernesia, the game continually builds suspense with every single narrative beat, while also giving more insight to the world, making the galaxy feel like it exists even when Shepard isn't in the picture. The first visit to the Citadel is a prime example of this, the Galactic Council's refusal to condemn Saren, the perpetrator of the attack on Eden Prime, both due to him being a Spectre, an agent of the Council who acts outside of jurisdiction to do whatever deemed necessary, and due to humanity being a new but volatile species in the galaxy, feels like a sensible plot beat that leads to the character interacting with the bulk of the main squad. Even though Shepard is the main character, they are still a character, based in the world with rules and a sense of established order. That plot aspect becomes more apparent within the writing of the side content as well. Assignments such as Biotics taking a boardroom of executives hostage is not only meant to be a gameplay challenge trying to save the hostages before they're executed, but add to the genuine dangers of being a human biotic, as well as how even in the final frontier space, issues such as capitalism and exploitation still exist. As mentioned before, the background the player character chooses also factors into the world building in a natural way, with some of the best writing present in these quests. A colonist-born Shepard trying to help a suicidal young girl who also managed to survive the colony being destroyed, an Alliance Black Ops organization known as Cerberus going rogue, a crime lord trying to take out the other bosses to gain leadership of their organization, and a biotic immune that is a result of the Torfan assault and how many Marines were lost in battle, are all prime examples of showing the grittiness of this universe that's under the sleek, futuristic feel, while not feeling overindulgent in the dark aspects. Such a deep level of writing, led by BioWare legend Drew Karpyshyn, is perhaps most prominent in the squad mates of Mass Effect, as it's arguable that they are BioWare's most iconic cast to date. Gary Spicarian, Ashley Williams, Kaidan Alenko, Erdnot Wrex, Tali Araya, and Liara Tachioni all managed to bring the teams and world building of Mass Effect alive, giving the player a deeper and more personalized look into the history and state of the world, though the human characters are notably more mixed in terms of their perception. Ashley is by far the most infamous squad mate due to her blatant xenophobia and racist comments against other species at the beginning of the game, while Kaidan is seen as less interesting, with his personality being more subdued, on top of him sharing the voice actor of Quaitho Nachi from Knights of the Old Republic, another infamous character in BioWare's repertoire. Despite this, Ashley nor Kaidan are necessarily bad characters, despite their flaws. Much of Ashley's character, despite going a bit overboard in her comments and actions, with her possibly gunning down Wrex being an extreme, isn't completely unjustified, as talking to her reveals her grandfather was the first and only human to surrender to an alien race, resulting in her career being marred and disgraced. Her distrust of the different species is based more on pragmatism, that other races will naturally look out for themselves, with the best option for humanity to be focusing on themselves, an opinion the trilogy both argues for and against in later plot beats, though she is not pro-human like other characters, resenting a pro-human and bigoted politician on the Citadel later in the game. While it does come across as a notable character flaw and even issue for many, having Ashley within the crew is a direct representation of xenophobia and distrust of other species that is a fundamental part of the Mass Effect series, including in the main antagonist of the first and third game. Yet, unlike them, Ashley recognizes his xenophobia and overcomes it. As for Kaidan, the notable issue with his writings is that much of his character development is finished before the player meets him, as he does not grow as much as the other characters do in the narrative. However, he provides insight into the dangers of biotics for humans, as well as the shady underpractices that led to his powers manifesting, while overall being a supportive character. Despite this, the heart of the companions within the first game are the alien species, and Mass Effect manages to have these characters stand out while being a representation of their respective species by having one key common trait between them all. They are the polar opposite of their species' expectations socially. Garrus is the third companion the character might meet, and contrasts the Tyrian's military regime by being a loose cannon that doesn't play by the rules, believing that catching the perpetrator as an officer is the best option regardless of collateral damage. He is the character that being a paragon or renegade is noticeable, as the player can either encourage his actions or disapprove and point towards being a protector of the people and the laws of the galaxy instead. Liara, despite being the daughter of the legendary matriarch Benezia and being an Asari, the space race identified with allure, biotic prowess, and wisdom, is an antisocial Prothean researcher, on top of being the result of two Ashari partners, taboo within Ashari culture. Tally is the only Korean seen in the game, and as such, contrasts with how the migrant fleet keeps to themselves instead of interacting with other species, though her story is based on coming of age. Wrex, however, is by far the most blatant representation of how Mass Effect's character writing excels in this regard. Shepard's first encounter with Wrex initially paints him as the average Krogan, a battle-weary race who excel as mercenaries ultimately committed to their job, shown when he kills his target Fist regardless of the player's decision, though this can be avoided if he's not a part of the squad. However, talking to Wrex reveals much more of the Krogan race, and how despite his despondent attitude towards them, he genuinely wants to see them recover from the genophage, a Salarian-made and Turian-deployed biological weapon that reduced the probability of viable pregnancies for the race, resulting in Krogan slowly dying out for centuries. His own personal mission even has the player recover the armor of his family from a Turian mercenary, showing his care and connection with his people further. This plot thread is pushed to its conclusion in the Virmire mission, in which it's revealed that Saren, the main antagonist of the game alongside the Reapers, has seemingly found a cure for the Krogan to breed an endless army to serve him and the Reapers. Wrex, seeing the possibility regardless of the risk, ends up in a confrontation with Shepard, and depending on the player's actions, Wrex can be killed by Ashley or Shepard, or convinced to stand down with either charm, intimidate, or by trusting Shepard due to them finding their family armor, not only providing a tense moment, but also rewarding the player for engaging with their squad mates, making them feel like actual people. These character beats are perfectly contrasted with Saren and the Geth, a representation of the Reapers. Up until Virmire, Saren is represented as a powerful Turian even within the Council or Spectres, as his command of the Geth via the legend of the Reapers, beings that were responsible for wiping out the Protheans 50,000 years ago, as well as his incredible voice acting and appearance, make his actions and presence felt before he and Shepard have a full character conversation. Having his theme be the game over screen as well adds to how dominating of a force he is. When even Matriarch Benezia notes how strong his influence is, resulting in a death he would have been done to her mind is incurable, the build-up to finally meeting up with Saren is perfect, with each mission building onto the Reapers and how they plan to return using the mysterious conduit. With every Prothean beacon and piece of information Shepard receives, the utter brutality and carnage the Protheans suffered at the hands of the Reapers becomes clearer and more horrifying on top of what has already been said. While Virmire can be done after the first completed main mission, completing it last seems to be ideal, as the mission design and structure continually build the tension of the eventual encounter. Heavy gunfights with the Geth and the larger tank-like units, the conflict between Wrex, having to choose between Kaidan and Ashley in terms of who to send with the Salarian espionage team to divert Saren's attention, and seeing the results of Saren's experiments being tortured and mind-controlled Salarians are of note. But what stands out before getting to the center of the facility is a talk with Ranith and Optus, who breaks down the effects of indoctrination, the influence and eventual control the Reapers gain over organics. What stands out specifically from her explanation, however, is that she believes Saren fears that he might be getting indoctrinated himself. Those fears are capitalized upon when Shepard and the squad meet Sovereign and realize the Reaper ship that Saren had been controlling is an actual Reaper. Everything about the plot of the entire trilogy revolves around this masterful moment. Saren is no longer the mastermind, but is no different than the Hush Shepard fights, only with his sanity more intact to be useful, as the goals of the Reapers are beyond even organic comprehension. The scale of Sovereign as a ship was already shown on Eden Prime, but realizing how truly powerful it is puts into perspective the utter galactic devastation that awaits should the Reapers return, further emphasized in the final fight, as Sovereign tears through multiple dreadnoughts and heavy ships with ease, taking the might of multiple fleets as well as Shepard defeating the Sovereign-possessed Saren to defeat it. Saren himself shows his true colors after this, believing that if organics willingly become slaves to the Reapers instead of fighting like the Protheans, they will be spared. Though this is a farce to further corrupt Saren's mind. making the seemingly inhumane characters see themselves as a savior of the galaxy through subjugation and doomed obedience is why Saren still stands out as one of gaming's best written villains. With all the praise of the writing with Sovereign, however, there is one glaring issue in terms of the Weepers, and that is their goals and how they're presented. From the moment they appear, their tentacle-esque design, organic subjugation, and aesthetics show inspiration from cosmic horror such as Lovecraft. Speaking on the inspiration, Carpentier notes, quote, "We had other influences on our game besides classic science fiction. We wanted to distinguish the Weepers from things like the Borg or other similar stuff. What we did, we went to the elder gods of the Lovecraft mythology. That's what we wanted to capture. These are the science fiction versions of the elder gods. Instead of the elder gods being demons sleeping beneath the earth in another realm, they are sentient, enormous spaceships looking up beyond the borders of space, of our known universe. When you talk to Sovereign, he drops hints that not only are these Weepers an unstoppable force, but they're also the ones who have essentially created life in our galaxy. They know that this pattern of organic life is going to keep happening, and they found the only way to control it is to direct its outcome. They aren't just destroyers, they're creators and destroyers at the same time. That's some of the stuff we wanted to play with and really push them into the science fiction realm of what a god might be in a hard science kind of universe." End quote. Mass Effect does portray the Weepers in the way Carpentier notes. However, with the Lovecraft, the regions, the understandings, and mythos of those beings are not only beyond human comprehension within those narratives, but they are never made explicitly clear. Cthulhu's motivations and actions are never explained because a key part of that horror is the mystery. Other franchises that deal with cosmic horror also exhibit this mystery, with Bloodborne, arguably the most known cosmic horror game of all time at this point, never revealing the wants or wishes of the Great Ones that humanity strives to advance to, with interpretations that they purposefully keep this knowledge away from humanity to protect them. However, that is at odds with the science fiction and role-playing aspects of Mass Effect. This is a universe where everything is not only established, but built upon to feel both comprehensive and complete, where even the most minute of details matter, as in the case with a lot of sci-fi. This situation puts the Weepers in a conflicting spot in terms of how they should be dealt with narratively. Should the Weepers be explained, possibly ruining both their mystique and horror, especially if the explanation doesn't match the presentation? Or should they be a mystery forever, in which Shepard being able to speak with one directly should have never happened, nor should there be any hopes of truly defeating them? Even before the infamous ending of Mass Effect 3, it becomes clear looking back that while fantastic in the scheme of this game, the Weeper reveal would set up a narrative problem BioWare struggled to figure out all the way to the conclusion of the trilogy. Thankfully, Mass Effect manages to overcome this narrative hurdle with the true themes of its story: unity and struggling with a utilitarian perspective over the moral perspective. Analyzing the themes of the game, Michael Aristotle and Brian Basayo note the final decision to save the Council is a prime example of the utilitarian themes the player is questioned with, noting that from the utilitarian standpoint, quote, "If we were to compare just the lives at stake, we are deciding whether 3 aliens plus their ship's crew should die so countless humans may live, or many human lives should be sacrificed to save that one Council ship. At this level, it would be better to allow the Council to be overtaken since there would be more living people to be happy." End quote. However, from a political and moral standpoint, the answer is far more questionable, as, quote, "preserving their lives maintains this representation, and these 3 races would, in general, continue to be happy," end quote, which results in humanity gaining a seat on the Council as a race that will help lead the galaxy. That notably contrasts with seizing power if they let the Council die. These questions form the backbone of Mass Effect's plot, as much of the differences between the Paragon and Renegade actions revolve around Shepard lending a hand to other races, or placing the wants and needs of humanity above all else. What helps compound this question is how, despite the different races being different in many ways in terms of culture and representation, they all feel naturally flawed, also showcasing these aspects of utilitarianism. Krogan were brought up as a warrior race to defeat the Rachni, waged wars of conquest in the Krogan Rebellion, and handled in a violent and desolate utilitarian solution via the Genophage. Whether that was the correct decision or not plagues the conflict between the Krogans, Solarians, and Terrians, with the statue of the Krogan in the Citadel Presidium being a notable piece of environmental storytelling and how accommodations and recognition by the elite are meant to be seen as reparations of atrocities, as even if the genophage was deemed necessary, hundreds of years later the Krogan are doomed to death, with figures like Wrex who note the problems within the Krogan race possibly being someone who can fix those problems that led the Krogan to the state that they are in. It also shows the flaws within the Terrians' focus on militarization and combat over diplomacy, as well as the Solarians' short-sighted goals, making a short-term solution but without thinking of the long-term consequences. Hence why the Asari exists as a diplomatic medium of the two races, with all of these aspects being present within the representation of humanity in the game. Hence why they are such a controversial race. Artificial intelligence also builds into the systematic structure, with the Geth being a slave race of AI that rebelled against their Quarian creators, pushing them away from their home planet and forcing them to live within their migrant fleet. From this alone, the game shows how complex the Geth as a synthetic race are, with their allegiance with the Weepers noted by Saren as manipulation that the Weepers will deliver unto their true freedom, showing how figures can insert themselves into different societies and use the religion and dogma to control said societies, similar to Paul Atreides and his rule of the Fremen from the Dune franchise. The fear of the Geth gaining consciousness as well as seeing organic life as hostile calls back to traditional science fiction and the danger of artificial intelligence. With the Geth's lack of dialogue and striking singular eye across all of the models fought, making them feel far more alien and hostile than any enemy fought in the game. Analyzing AI within science fiction, Isabella Herman notes how, quote, when it comes to stories of powerful and omnipotent AI systems exercising total control over humans or humanity, they show the fear of impotence and helplessness of the individual in the face of superordinate structures. They reflect the dangers of dictatorship, anti-democratic societies, and suppression of freedom of choice, often working with historic references to colonialism and totalitarian regimes, end quote. Which is one of the best ways to describe the threat of the Weepers in terms of Mass Effect. Directly discussing politics, however, is where Mass Effect notably becomes muddled. Within the narrative, characters see politics as a negative. Ambassador Udina, the political representation of humanity at the beginning of the game, is represented as callous, pragmatic, and focused on Shepard becoming expected to further push the human agenda, even betraying the player near the end of the game to gain the graces of the Council, who themselves are not represented in a fashionable light either, despite most of their concerns and criticisms of Shepard outside of the Terrian Council's distrust of humanity being valid within the setting. Udina is contrasted with Captain Anderson, the militaristic mentor of Shepard. And even though Anderson is an enjoyable character, the fact that the game puts its faith in positive representation into the military over politics undermines the themes of unity and conflict that Mass Effect wants to build upon, where multiple military characters, including Ashley, note the disdain of politics. This culminates in Shepard breaking galactic law to stop the Weepers, and while justified, lacks the nuance other aspects of the story show. Shepard being expected themselves builds against that nuance. As though Shepard's morality is based on the player, the very notion of them being an agent that can do anything to succeed in the mission, regardless of the law, feels at odds with the otherwise progressive themes. Shepard's prime inspiration, Jack Bauer from 24, is a perfect representation of the mixed political messaging. Bauer, by extension 24, representative of the American values at the time in response to 9/11. His violence, torture, and unethical methods clash with his otherwise notable goals of saving the day, as well as him being the only person who can do it. This notably reflects how much of the attitude the United States had in response to 9/11 and the War on Terror. Analyzing Bauer as a response to 9/11, Ted Tanau describes how, quote, Americans, at least many of them, have a similar view of America's mission in the world. There is a grave terrorist threat out there, and though we're wounded, it's up to us, the US of A, to handle it. Who else can give that kind of leadership so urgently demanded? Europe? They're effete and self-conflicted. Africa? It's too mired in its own problems. Asia? They're either part of the problem or not interested in helping. Nope. It's either us or no one, wounded though we are. And if we do some evil along the way, just remember that we didn't come looking for this job. It came looking for us. End quote. That sense of responsibility is shown directly in Shepard, regardless of morality, with the game framing Shepard, humanity, and the Alliance as the species that will ultimately lead the galaxy to newer heights as well as defeating the Reapers, with the decision to save or doom the Council based on the Alliance helping at the cost of human lives, catalyzing this narrative choice. Though BioWare is a Canadian studio, that style of thinking is also shown extensively in the Bring Down the Sky DLC, in which a group of Batarians, a race that lived in the Terminus system that came into conflict with humanity in their rapid colonization, planned to bomb the planet Terra Nova with its orbiting asteroid used for minerals and resources. Batarians, unlike every other race within Mass Effect, are never shown a direct alternative other than hostility for the majority of the series, despite claims that not every Batarian is hostile or dangerous. Their role of frustration and later conflict with humanity's colonization of worlds, their terroristic threats, and the scenario of Bring Down the Sky, ending with Shepard having to choose whether to catch the Batarians at the expense of hostages or let them go to disarm bombs and save the hostages, with the context of inspiration from 24, draws notable parallels between the game's universe and the War on Terror Bush-era politics of the 2000s. In a franchise where the Geth, the major enemies of the first game, obtain depth in terms of the Reapers using their faith to manipulate them, and garner even more depth in terms of AI in the later games, having Batarians be this hostile and lacking any opposite representation like the other alien races feels like a notable misstep, considering how much more of a focus they will get in the sequel. Despite this, Mass Effect still pushes for unity, growth, and connection above all else, which makes its other political choices in the grand scheme of the narrative not have too much impact upon the quality of the game. And that can be said for Mass Effect as a whole, in terms of gameplay and design. Though having notable imperfections, Mass Effect still stands the test of time as a revolutionary work of art, not just in the role-playing genre, but in the gaming industry. From its innovations in animation, presentation, and dialogue, to its ambitious exploration and world building, to its incredibly constructive narrative, Mass Effect is still triumphant. And even though it never reaches the high of the original plan for the franchise, nearly 2 decades later, it still manages to be the zenith of the space opera within gaming. Well, if you've got this far, I would just like to say thank you for watching. This is my first ever official video game analysis in this type of wave, in this type of field. I mean, as you could probably tell, there's a bit of imperfections and blemishes with this. I'm hoping to get those ironed out and to just improve upon my craft as I continue. But I just want to say thank you for watching, thank you for enjoying, share, leave comments, tell me what you like, tell me what I can improve. If there's something that, you might disagree with, I would like to know, of course, civilly. But yeah, just thank you for watching. Hope you look forward to my next video, which will be about Mass Effect 2. Yeah, that'll be a fun topic to talk about, and I just hope that you all have a wonderful day. Thank you.